Eleanor's world was one of quiet routines and meticulously ordered shelves, both in the public library where she worked and in the small apartment that had been her sanctuary for 3 decades. She traced the rim of her chipped teacup, a familiar comfort against fingers stained faintly with the ink of 1,000 stories. Outside her window, a persistent drizzle painted the city in shades of gray, blurring the streetlights into soft, impressionistic halos. This view, like her life, was predictable, calm, and solitary. Her days were measured in the hushed turning of pages and the gentle rhythm of stamping books. Her evenings were for weak tea, mended cardigans, and the company of characters who lived only in print. It wasn't a lonely existence, she often told herself, but a peaceful one. Yet, in the quietest moments, a flicker of longing would surface, a desire for a trip to the Scottish Highlands she'd only read about, or the simple luxury of buying a new coat instead of patching the old one for the 5th time. This carefully balanced peace was joyfully disrupted the day her niece Lily burst through the door, her face glowing with a light that seemed to push back the apartment's shadows. Lily was her sister's daughter, but their bond was something deeper, forged in late-night talks, shared secrets, and Eleanor's unwavering presence at every school play and graduation. Lily, with her wild curls and a laugh that echoed with untamed hope, was the vibrant, colorful story Eleanor had never lived herself. "He asked me, Auntie Elle," Lily had breathed, sinking onto the worn floral sofa. She held out her hand, and on her finger was a simple, delicate ring. It wasn't large or flashy, but it shone with the impossible brightness of a captured star. His name was James, a kind-hearted architect with a steady gaze and a smile that always reached his eyes. Eleanor's heart, a muscle she thought had grown quiet with time, performed a series of joyful, unfamiliar leaps. But in the weeks that followed, the brilliant light of the engagement began to dim. During her weekly visits to her sister's house, Eleanor became an unintentional witness to hushed, worried conversations. She'd see her sister Helen at the kitchen table, a calculator and a pile of bills beside her, her brow furrowed. She'd hear snippets of phrases drift from the other room. "The venue alone is. We just can't stretch it that far. Maybe something smaller." The worst was seeing the change in Lily. The boundless excitement was being carefully packed away, replaced by a forced, pragmatic cheerfulness. "A small ceremony at City Hall would be just as meaningful, right?" Lily had said to Eleanor one afternoon, her voice a little too bright. "It's about the marriage, not the wedding." But Eleanor saw the truth in the slump of her shoulders and the way she quickly changed the subject when a wedding commercial came on television. Lily's dream, a day surrounded by flowers and family, a day to feel like the heroine of her own story, was quietly slipping away, a casualty of practicality. That evening, Eleanor sat alone in her apartment, the silence amplifying the conflict in her mind. She pulled out the worn, leather-bound ledger where she tracked her savings. For 40 years, she had diligently set aside a small portion of her modest librarian's salary. It was her someday fund. Someday for a new roof. Someday for proper care if her health failed. Someday for a trip to see the castles in Scotland. It was the physical proof of a life of discipline and self-denial. She looked at the final balance, a number that felt both monumental and insignificant. Then she closed her eyes and pictured Lily's face. Not the brave, smiling mask she wore now, but the uninhibited joy of the little girl who used to fall asleep in her lap, smelling of sunshine and storybooks. The choice became clear. What was a someday that might never come compared to a today that she could make beautiful for someone she loved so dearly? Her rainy day fund was meant for a storm, and a storm was threatening to wash away her niece's happiness. The next day, she invited Lily and James over. Her hands trembled as she served the tea, the cups rattling softly in their saucers. "A funny thing has happened," she began, her voice carefully rehearsed. "You know my cousin Martha, the one who moved to Australia? It seems she left me a small, unexpected inheritance. It's not a fortune," she lied, the words feeling foreign and heavy on her tongue, "but it's more than I need, and I can't think of a better use for it." The mixture of shock, hesitation, and overwhelming relief on their faces was a sight she would engrave in her memory. They protested, of course. It was too much. They couldn't possibly accept. But Eleanor was gentle, yet immovable. "Nonsense," she insisted, her voice gaining strength. "Family is for this. This is my joy. Please let me have this joy." Her only condition was that her involvement remain a secret. She met once with the wedding planner they hired, a sharp and perceptive man named Mr. Harrison. In his polished office, she arranged the bank transfer. "I want to be clear," Eleanor told him, her gaze direct. "My name is not to be mentioned. This is a gift from Lily's family. The focus must be entirely on the bride and groom. Mr. Harrison adjusted his spectacles, studying her for a long moment. He saw the frayed cuffs of her coat, the simple, inexpensive shoes she wore. He saw a quiet woman giving away a sum of money that was clearly significant to her, and he understood. "I respect your wishes completely, madam," he said, his tone softening with a deference that went beyond mere professionalism. "Your secret is safe." And so Eleanor retreated to the sidelines, her life becoming even more spare. She started watering down her soups and returned her library books a day early to avoid any chance of a late fee. But every time Lily called, her voice bubbling with excitement about the string quartet they'd booked or the taste of the wedding cake, a profound, nourishing warmth spread through Eleanor's chest. She was invisible, a ghost in the machinery of this grand affair, but she was the architect of it all. And for her, that was more than enough. The day of the wedding arrived under a sky of brilliant, cloudless blue, a stark contrast to the dreary grays that had mirrored Eleanor's frugal life for the past year. In her small apartment, she laid out her outfit, the best she owned, a simple lavender dress she'd bought for another occasion years ago. It was neat and respectable, but as she looked at her reflection, she couldn't help but notice the way the fabric had thinned slightly at the elbows, or how the color seemed to have faded, much like herself. She had forgone buying a new hat, convincing herself it was an unnecessary extravagance. Instead, she pinned her silvery hair up in a careful, elegant twist, a style that spoke of quiet dignity. A taxi, her one planned indulgence for the day, carried her out of the city and towards the countryside. With every mile, the landscape grew greener and more majestic, until they turned onto a long gravel driveway flanked by ancient oak trees. At the end of it stood Northwood Manor, a breathtaking estate of pale stone and ivy-covered walls, surrounded by gardens bursting with a riot of color. It was even more magnificent than the pictures Lily had shown her. This was the place her sacrifice had built. A wave of pride, warm and pure, washed over her, momentarily erasing any feeling of self-consciousness. As she stepped out of the cab, the air was filled with the gentle melody of a string quartet playing from the grand terrace and the murmur of cheerful, elegantly dressed guests. Men in sharp suits and women in vibrant dresses and elaborate hats drifted across the lawns, champagne flutes in hand. For a moment, Eleanor felt like an intruder, a drab sparrow that had accidentally wandered into a flock of peacocks. She clutched her small, worn handbag a little tighter and reminded herself why she was here. For Lily. She saw her niece from a distance, standing near a floral archway. Lily was a vision in white, her dress shimmering in the sunlight, her face alight with a joy so radiant it seemed to generate its own gravity. James stood beside her, his eyes fixed on her as if she were the only person in the world. The sight was so perfect, so utterly beautiful, that a lump formed in Eleanor's throat. This was worth it. Every watered-down soup, every cold evening, it was all worth it for this one perfect moment. An usher, a young man with a polite but distracted smile, approached her with a seating chart on a clipboard. "Name, please?" "Eleanor Vance," she replied softly. His finger scanned the list. Down, down, down it went. He frowned for a second. Then his face cleared. "Ah, yes, Miss Vance. Right this way." He led her away from the main lawn where the ceremony was to take place, away from the rows of white chairs filled with smiling family and friends. They walked past the beautiful floral arrangements, past the string quartet, towards the back of the terrace. He stopped at a small solitary table tucked away in a corner, partially obscured by a large stone pillar and situated uncomfortably close to the swinging doors that led to the kitchen. Through them, Eleanor could already hear the clatter of plates and the muffled shouts of the catering staff. "Here you are," the usher said, gesturing to the seat before turning away to greet a more boisterously dressed couple arriving behind them. Eleanor stood frozen for a moment, staring at the table. Table 23. It was the last table, a world away from table 1, where her sister Helen, her husband, and James's parents were taking their seats. She could see them, their laughter carrying on the breeze, completely unaware of where she had been placed. She was seated further back than distant cousins she barely knew, further back than James's colleagues from work. She was in the annex of the celebration, a forgotten footnote in the story she had authored. The initial pride she had felt upon arriving curdled into a cold, heavy stone in the pit of her stomach. It wasn't anger. It was a deeper, more hollow ache. It was the sting of invisibility. After all she had done, after giving up her security and her dreams for this very day, she had been deemed so unimportant as to be placed by the service door. She understood with a painful clarity that in their happiness, in the whirlwind of planning this grand event, She had been completely and utterly overlooked. They had not just kept her secret, they had forgotten her presence. She sank into the chair, her legs suddenly feeling weak. From her vantage point, she could barely see the floral arch. When the ceremony began, Lily and James were just small, distant figures. She couldn't make out the expression on Lily's face as she said her vows, nor could she hear the tremor in James's voice. The carefully chosen words, the promises of a lifetime, were stolen by the distance and the intermittent clatter from the kitchen. She focused on the back of Lily's head, on the way the sunlight caught in her veil. She poured all her love, all her blessings into that single point of focus, trying to send them across the expanse of manicured lawn. She willed her heart to feel nothing but joy for her niece. She told herself it didn't matter where she sat. It didn't matter if no one knew what she'd done. Lily was happy. That was the point. That had always been the entire point. But as the crowd rose to their feet, erupting in applause as the couple shared their first kiss, a single, silent tear escaped and traced a cold path down Eleanor's cheek. She wiped it away quickly, hoping no one had seen. But then again, she thought with a pang of irony, no one was looking. After the ceremony, the guests were guided from the sun-drenched terrace into the grand ballroom of Northwood Manor. The room was even more stunning than the grounds outside. Towering arched windows flooded the space with late afternoon light, which glittered off a collection of crystal chandeliers hanging like frozen constellations from the ornate ceiling. The tables were draped in ivory linens and adorned with extravagant floral centerpieces that mirrored the gardens. The air buzzed with laughter, the clinking of glasses, and the swell of orchestral music. It was a scene ripped from the pages of a fairy tale, a perfect, gleaming world of joy. And Eleanor observed it all from her lonely outpost, table 23. As guests found their seats, the reality of her position sank in even further. Her table was so far from the head table that Lily and James were just brightly colored shapes in the distance. The pillar beside her, which had been a minor obstruction outside, now blocked her view almost completely. She had to lean uncomfortably to one side just to catch a glimpse of the main festivities. The swinging doors to the kitchen continued their rhythmic swoosh thump, each time releasing a wave of heat, frenetic energy, and the scent of garlic and roasting meat, a jarring sensory intrusion into the perfumed elegance of the ballroom. She watched as her sister Helen bustled about near the front, adjusting a flower here, chatting with a guest there, the proud mother of the bride in her element. Once, Helen's eyes scanned the room, a broad smile on her face. For a fleeting second, her gaze seemed to pass over Eleanor's corner, but there was no spark of recognition, no wave. It was as if Eleanor was hidden by a shadow, rendered invisible by the sheer distance and her own quiet demeanor. The meal began. Waiters emerged from the kitchen doors, a seamless, efficient army. Course after course was laid before the guests. Eleanor recognized the menu from Lily's excited descriptions: the delicate salmon mousse, the rich beef Wellington she had specifically requested, and the decadent chocolate lava cake. She had imagined the taste of these dishes, the cost of them adding up in her ledger. Now, as the food was placed before her, it felt like ashes in her mouth. She ate slowly, mechanically, each bite a reminder of her isolation. The rich flavors felt obscene when consumed in such solitude. Around her, the party raged on. People from neighboring tables, though none were particularly near, would occasionally stand up to mingle, table hopping to chat with old friends or new acquaintances. But no one ventured into the forgotten corner of table 23. Eleanor sat with a polite, fixed smile, her back straight, a perfect portrait of dignified loneliness. She felt like a ghost at the feast, present in body but entirely absent in spirit and connection. She had paid for every plate, every glass of champagne, every petal on every flower, yet she was afforded less warmth and inclusion than the most distant acquaintance of the groom. The irony was a bitter pill. Finally, as the dessert plates were cleared, a hush fell over the room as the master of ceremonies, a cheerful man with a booming voice, stepped up to the microphone. It was time for the speeches. First came Lily's father, his voice thick with emotion as he spoke of his beautiful daughter and welcomed James into the family. Then came the best man, who shared a series of funny and heartfelt anecdotes about the groom that had the room roaring with laughter. Eleanor listened to it all, a distant observer of an intimacy she felt she had no part in. She clapped when everyone else clapped, her soft applause lost in the general din. Lily and James looked incandescently happy, their hands clasped tightly on the table, their faces turned towards each speaker. This, Eleanor reminded herself again, was the goal. This was the finished painting. She was merely the scaffolding, meant to be dismantled and forgotten once the masterpiece was complete. She should be content. She truly, desperately wanted to be. And now, the master of ceremonies announced, "We have one final person who would like to say a few words." This is a bit unconventional, but he was instrumental in creating this magical day. Please join me in welcoming the wedding planner, Mr. Harrison. A polite, slightly confused applause rippled through the room. A wedding planner giving a speech? It was highly unusual. Eleanor's heart gave a sudden, sharp jolt. She instinctively straightened up, her eyes locking onto the figure of Mr. Harrison as he walked calmly to the microphone. He was as she remembered him from their one meeting, tall, impeccably dressed, with a calm, serious demeanor. He adjusted the microphone, his gaze sweeping across the room. He didn't look at the head table. He didn't look at the guests in the front rows. His eyes scanned the room, past the center, past the mingling crowds, all the way to the back, to the forgotten corner, to the table partially hidden by a stone pillar. For the first time all day, Eleanor felt truly seen. Their eyes met across the vast, glittering expanse of the ballroom, and in his gaze she saw not pity, but a profound and unmistakable respect. "Good evening, everyone," Mr. Harrison began, his voice clear and steady, commanding the attention of the entire room. "I am not usually one for public speaking at my clients' events. My job is to remain behind the scenes to ensure everything runs smoothly. But today, I asked the bride and groom for permission to break with tradition, because there is a story behind this beautiful wedding that deserves to be told. A story of generosity, of quiet sacrifice, and of a love so profound it is, in itself, the foundation upon which this entire day has been built." Mr. Harrison paused, letting the weight of his opening words settle over the silent ballroom. Every guest, from the front row family to the distant colleagues, was captivated. Lily and James exchanged a confused look, their smiles faltering slightly. They assumed he was about to praise their taste or their wonderful families. "When I was first hired," Mr. Harrison continued, his voice resonating with a quiet authority, "I was told that the budget for this beautiful event was being provided by a stroke of good fortune, a small, unexpected inheritance from a distant relative. It was a lovely story, plausible, and it allowed the planning to proceed to create the magical day that Lily and James so clearly deserved." He took a slow, deliberate look towards the head table. "But the story, as lovely as it was, wasn't the truth. There was no inheritance. There was no distant, forgotten cousin. There was only a single source of funding. A single benefactor whose love for her niece was so immense, she was willing to give up everything she had saved for her own future to make her niece's dream a reality." A collective audible gasp swept through the room. Lily's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with disbelief. She looked at her parents, who looked back with equal confusion. James's brow furrowed, his mind racing to understand. Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face. Her heart was hammering against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. This couldn't be happening. Mr. Harrison had promised. This public revelation was the one thing she had never wanted. She felt 100 pairs of eyes starting to search the room, looking for the anonymous hero. She wanted to shrink, to disappear into the shadow of the pillar beside her. This benefactor, Mr. Harrison's voice grew softer, more personal, did not do this for recognition. In fact, she made me promise that her name would never be mentioned. She wanted only to be a quiet observer, to watch the happiness she had created from the sidelines. She gave a gift that I can only describe as the entirety of her life savings, a nest egg built over 40 years of quiet, diligent work. She sacrificed her own security, her own dreams of comfort in her later years, so that today could be perfect. He let that sink in. The silence in the room was now absolute, thick with emotion and dawning comprehension. Eleanor's sister Helen went pale, her mind finally connecting the dots, the sudden influx of cash, Eleanor's increasingly frugal habits, her worn-out dress. The truth hit her with the force of a physical blow. Her gaze shot across the room, her eyes finally finding her sister, tucked away in the corner, and her face crumpled with a mixture of shame and awe. Then, Mr. Harrison did the one thing Eleanor had prayed he wouldn't. He turned his body, his hand gesturing gracefully but definitively towards the back of the room. And she has been sitting here all day, overlooked. The very heart of this celebration has been seated in the shadows. Ladies and gentlemen, the person you should all be thanking for this unforgettable day is the bride's aunt, Miss Eleanor Vance. Every head in the ballroom turned. It was like a single, massive wave, cresting and turning towards her corner. The spotlight, which had been on the stage, swung over, and after a moment's searching, it found her. It flooded table 23 with a brilliant, unforgiving light. There was nowhere left to hide. Eleanor sat blinking in the glare, her face a pale oval, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The ghost at the feast was suddenly, blindingly visible. For a long moment, no one moved. Then, Lily pushed her chair back so forcefully it nearly toppled over. Tears were streaming down her face, washing away her perfectly applied makeup. "Auntie Elle?" she whispered. Her voice choked with a sound that was half question, half realization. Ignoring the stunned crowd, she began to walk. Not a delicate, bridal glide, but a determined, almost frantic pace. James was right behind her, his own eyes shining with unshed tears of gratitude and shock. They moved through the tables, a path clearing for them as if by magic. They walked past their parents, past their friends, past the entire hierarchy of their own wedding, their eyes locked on the small, trembling figure at the very back of the room. When Lily reached the table, she didn't say anything. She simply dropped to her knees, wrapped her arms around Eleanor's waist, and sobbed into her lap, her whole body shaking. "Oh, Auntie Elle," she cried, her voice muffled by the simple lavender fabric. "Why? Why didn't you tell me? I had no idea." Eleanor, her own tears now flowing freely, stroked Lily's hair, her hand trembling. "Shh, my dear," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "It doesn't matter. Seeing you this happy, that's all that ever mattered." James knelt beside them, taking Eleanor's other hand in both of his. He pressed it to his cheek. "Eleanor," he said, his voice cracking, "thank you. There are no words. Thank you for giving us this. We are so sorry." He looked at the table number, 23, and then at the swinging kitchen doors, and a look of deep, profound shame crossed his face. From the front of the room, Helen was on her feet, her husband holding her arm as she wept openly. The story was now complete in everyone's mind. They had celebrated in splendor while the woman who paid for it all was forgotten in a corner. Slowly, gracefully, Eleanor helped Lily to her feet, and then a sound began. A single person clapping. It was Mr. Harrison at the microphone. Then another guest joined in, and another. Within seconds, the entire ballroom was on its feet, a thunderous, sustained standing ovation rolling towards her. It was not polite applause. It was a roar of respect, of emotion, of admiration for the quiet, unassuming woman in the faded lavender dress. James gently took the microphone from a stagehand. His voice when he spoke was filled with a power and emotion that no one had heard before. "Everyone, this is not just our benefactor. This is the heart of our family. This is the woman who showed us what love truly means. The seat of honor at this wedding was never at the head table. It was right here, at table 23. But we would be honored if she would join us at the front." Eleanor, flanked by the bride and groom, was gently led through the cheering crowd. As she passed her sister, Helen grabbed her arm, her face etched with regret and love. "Oh, Elle," she whispered, "forgive me." Eleanor simply squeezed her hand, a silent gesture of absolution. They placed a new chair for her at the head table, right between Lily and James. They each took one of her hands. The ache in her heart, the cold stone of invisibility, had vanished. In its place, a warmth spread through her entire being, more comforting than any new coat, more precious than any life savings. She was no longer a ghost, no longer a spectator. She was seen. She was celebrated. She was home. As the evening continued, she didn't just watch the joy. She was at the very center of it, finally a part of the beautiful story she had written.